Okay, so the purpose of this exercise is to understand the basic properties of watercolors and all the things that they are capable of. This is just a very basic 12 different techniques that you are going to learn that will help you create really interesting and unique works with watercolor. Now the first thing you want to do is get your watercolor palette. This is just an inexpensive one I got from Hobby Lobby, and I'm going to take some water and get it wet just to activate the watercolors. So with this exercise, the first thing that we're going to want to do is work with the masking fluid and the glaze. The reason why we are going to do these two sections first is so that they have time to dry. Beginning with the masking fluid, I have this brand here, the Winsor & Newton Colorless Art Masking Fluid, and these are latex. This one, I believe, it's latex, so if you have an allergy to latex, you want to be careful. Something very important to remember about these is that this will ruin your brush. And you will see I haven't used this one for a long time. It's got the nice gooey stuff in the middle. So if I were to use the bristles of my brush, this would dry in my bristles and ruin my paintbrush because it's essentially rubber. So I'm going to use the end of my paintbrush, just dip it in there, and in that section, just going to create an interesting pattern with the masking fluid. Now the purpose of the masking fluid, well, I'm going to wipe off my brush really quick. Just use your paper towel. The purpose of the masking fluid is to preserve the white paper, because in watercolor there is no white paint. There is, but it doesn't work very well. To preserve, you make your bright whites. So if you were painting something and needed a highlight, you would use masking fluid, paint it where the highlight would go, and wait for it to dry, and then paint your watercolors over it. Now I'm using some masking tape here and just putting down a few pieces, which this essentially does the same thing. This is the brand Frog Tape. My husband uses it when he's painting around the house. But you can use any sort of masking tape. You just have to be careful. The longer that you leave it on, the more the adhesive sticks to the paper, and the more likely it is to rip the paper when you remove it. So you need to be careful. Next up is the glaze. I'm going to get my brush, my water, and I'm gonna pick a color, any color. This is a fun palette. And I'm literally just going to put down a stripe of color. This is going to show you how layering colors over each other works in watercolor, because it's a very transparent medium, but you have to be careful. You have to wait for it to dry first. Okay, starting with the graded wash. Now we're gonna have a little bit of fun here. I'm going to use a round brush and get my brush wet. And I'm gonna grab a color. And what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna start off by laying down a pool of color at the top of the section. I'm gonna rinse my brush out really good and just get it wet so there's just water in there. And with just the wet brush, get some more water, I'm gonna pull down that color to make a graded, just like a gradual wash. Don't want to mess with it too much, because with watercolor, less is more. The more you mess with the watercolor and the water on the papers, the more likely you are to start ruining the paper. And since we have a lower quality paper, because we're on a budget, You don't want to mess with it too much. Okay, this next section is wet on wet. It's exactly what it sounds like. I'm just gonna put some water in this section. Always have paper towels handy. And I'm gonna get a color. And I'm just gonna put some color in. You can see since the paper was wet, the watercolors spread and bleed. So that's something to really consider and think about when you are doing a painting. If you have a wet section and then you start to paint, say it's yellow and you start to paint red next to it, the red would bleed into the yellow if it was still wet. So that's something to consider and remember when you're working on your paintings. Now this next section, which is wet on dry, is exactly what it sounds like. So I'm gonna grab some color. I have a wet brush with wet paint. And I'm just going to put down a few brush strokes. See, the color doesn't blend. It doesn't bleed, it doesn't go anywhere compared to the wet on dry. Or excuse me, wet on wet. Now for the drop color, we are going to get that section completely wet. This is very helpful to have 2 containers of water, one to clean your brush out to get the main paint out and then another to rinse out the rest, so you have clear water to use. It will help when you're doing exercises like this and in any of your paintings to keep your paint clean and your brush clean. Anyways, dropping on color, I grabbed some color. I'm just gonna drop a couple drops on. See if I can zoom in and you can see how that's bleeding. Let's see, I'm gonna get some green. This is just a fun exercise. You can just drop some more water. Just seeing how the paint interacts with the water on your paper. Now for the dry brush technique, you are going to use a dry brush. This one I haven't quite used yet. And if you have used a brush, just use paper towel to get really dry. And you want the bristles to kind of do that. So I'm going to dip into my paint I have here. And using a dry brush, I'm going to kind of spread the bristles a little bit. And you can see the texture that would create using the dry brush. Many opportunities in different scenarios you can use this for, such as making grass or fur on a teddy bear or horse or anything. You can just use it for any sort of texture. Okay, blotting and lifting. Now I'm going to do a wet on wet. Let me get the paper wet first. Let's see, I'm going to use a more pigmented color so you can see. I'm going to use this bright blue. Now with blotting, you use paper towels or a tissue and you can just lift out the color. Same thing for lifting. You get a wet brush, a clean brush, get it dry, and it will essentially act like a vacuum. You just kind of suck up your paint. So that's one way of doing that. You can use this technique when trying to create interesting like trees and sticks, trying to lift out color where you got too much. It's a fun technique to use. All of these techniques are fun. Next up is the alcohol, because my masking fluid has not dried yet. I am going to do, once again, another wet on wet. And you want to use some darker colors for this technique. Some colors mixed together. And just kind of swirl them together on the paper. Now, alcohol has a reaction to the water and the pigments. What you want to do is use the small eyedropper that we have in class, or see, I have this spray bottle. I am just going to get a little bit out and see, oh, just drop it. So cool. Look at that. It has such a neat effect for backgrounds, for creating abstract things, for art journaling. The opportunities are endless when it comes to watercolors. Okay, for the salt, we're going to do, once again, another wet on wet. This works best with a highly pigmented color. Just going to put some colors down, blues and greens. And I'm going to use, you can use just a fine regular salt. I'm going to show you two different techniques here. So a little bit goes a long way. You don't need much, just a pinch. And make sure it kind of falls sporadically. You can see that. Throw it over your shoulder when you're done for good luck. I don't know why it's good luck, but it is. And I have this rock salt. Whoops. So, you can see the different coarsenesses in salt. You can have a thinner salt, a thicker salt, and see the different effects it gets. The salt acts, it pulls the moisture towards itself, so it creates these interesting little patterns and textures, and it pools, the color pools around each little grain of salt. So it's very interesting. It's somewhat unpredictable how it's going to turn out, but it's great for making textures in water, for sky and snow, and many other things. Look what I just did. You see that? I just pulled my paint tray through my whole cool salt pattern I was making. So here's something like this happens with a project. Try to dab up your color as much as you can, as quickly as you can. Whoops. Learn from our mistakes, right? Happy accidents, as Bob Ross would say. You can kind of rub some water in these places and try to lift up the color that's there. And since this is just a practice exercise, it's not that special, but still not happy there. Anyways, we'll move on to the rice now. Okay, rice. Guess what we're gonna do? Same thing, wet on wet, because that's my favorite, and that's just how these techniques work the best. Rice is gonna essentially do the same thing that the salt did, or is doing, or gonna do. You want to get some fun colors down in there. And the rice absorbs moisture. You know, if you ever drop your phone in the toilet or in a puddle, throw it in a bag of rice for like a couple hours, day, and it'll suck all the moisture out. So it's essentially going to do the same thing here. You can already see the color pooling around little grains of rice, and it's just going to create a really interesting and unique texture. Now for plastic wrap, guess what? We're gonna do wet on wet again, because it's so fun. I love this one. You can use this one for so many things. It just makes everything look really cool. The texture that you get from the plastic wrap and the watercolors is just awesome. So you can see I just did wet on wet and I just dropped color into a puddle. And you want some good juicy color for this one. Just take a piece of plastic wrap and you lay it onto the section and you squish it. You can use this technique with acrylic paints too, with like fluid acrylics. It makes for a really unique backdrop. You want to use colors that blend well together because you can see my pinks and purples and that turquoise I had a lot of blue in it, so instead of making brown, it's going to make a really pretty, interesting purple. And I think we're ready for glaze. Okay, so for the glaze, I am just going to do, I've got that green, so I think I'm going to use a red. You can tell my son uses these sometimes. They're all messy. I swear it's not just me. I'm going to do that across. Rinse my brush out really well, and I'm going to get some yellow. You can see the yellow, once I swiped across, you can see that I picked up some of the pigment from below because watercolors are activated by water. So remember that this is all a learning experience, and the learning curves with watercolors, lots of fun stuff can happen. I'm going to do one more color with the glaze. I want a transparent color. So I think I'm just going to do a light purple. And same thing. But you can kind of see how the colors interact together. Okay, I've given it some time and my masking fluid has dried and it's pretty sticky. It's kind of like a rubber cement, which actually rubber cement would work fine if you don't have masking fluid. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to do wet on wet. What? I am just going to paint over it. With some fun colors. That wasn't a very fun color. It doesn't show up very well. Pink. Everybody likes pink. There we go. So, there we go. I'm just going to do that. And I'm going to let that paint dry. And by the time that paint's dry, my plastic wrap might be dry. And I can take everything off and show you guys how it all looks when it's done. Okay, so here's the fun part. I already took off the plastic wrap and you can see the really cool patterns that it made. It's just neat. Rice just falls right off and it looks like rice. Kind of looks like a petri dish. And salt. This one isn't entirely dry around the big pieces, but kind of see it sparkles. And you can see the bigger chunks of salt leave different patterns than the finer grains of salt. So it totally depends on what you're going for. Now this is mostly dry. I'm going to peel off the tape. So you can see the point of having the tape is to leave white spaces. So you could use contact paper and cut out really intricate shapes and things, or even that out of the tape and paint it over it and I'll mask it. Now the masking fluid, you just rub it. Very much like when you get glue stuck on your fingers. I'll put this down so I can get it better. If you have larger areas, they make, not fun, they make like an eraser, a hard eraser that you can rub on there so you don't mess smudge stuff with your fingers. It's like little rubbery boogers. There's another piece still on there. But see, so you can see that if you want to leave white space, you would use the masking fluid or the tape. And you can tell that my tape, when I rubbed it, my paint wasn't completely dry because the paint smudged in the white space. So you want to make sure everything is completely dry. But that is our finished exercise from graded wash through glaze, all the different things. Well, just a few, so 12 of the many different techniques that you can achieve with watercolors.